Okay, how you doing? This is NSCA Chapter 19, presentation number 7. We're talking about eating disorders here. Now, with eating disorders, um, there's a couple different things to go over here, and I got to give you a little advance warning regarding eating disorders. The way they write this up in this chapter, it can be a little bit confusing, so I'll do my best to try to parse through it and organize the thoughts for you. It's a number of different conditions, right? It can be a number of different conditions that cause a person to focus on their body weights, perhaps their appearance, perhaps their performance in a sport. And it can definitely have a negative influence on the person's health and mental well being. And eating disorders are usually classified as a mental health illness because that's the root cause of it. And statistically speaking, they state that about 30 million men and women will experience an eating disorder at some point in their lifetime. And I would have to say that, when you look at the different types of eating disorders, I'd say perhaps that's probably spot on accurate. And it's not exclusive just to females, but in fact, many males would suffer from that. When we look at eating disorders, and you need to kind of park this thought just on the side here. When we talk about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that's a DSM. It's kind of a desk reference book, if you will, for mental disorders. And the book references this going forward, but they do so under the terminology DSM. So realize that's what that is. The predominant eating disorders that you have, and this is where the alphabet soup comes in with the DSM, the ICM, and the ED, and the BN, and the AN, the BED. Holy smokes, there's so many letters I can't handle it. But the three main eating disorders that they talk about in this chapter: anorexia nervosa, and then bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. If we were to look at the etymology of anorexia nervosa, anorexia means without appetite. That's Greek, ironically, right? Nervosa, nerves. So in essence, what you're saying is anorexia nervosa is without appetite and nervous. Kind of like nervous without appetite would be another way to say it. Bulimia nervosa, BN, as denoted over here. Bulimia means ravenous hunger in Greek. And then when you look at this again with nervosa being nerves, when you say bulimia nervosa, it's in essence saying nervous, ravenous hunger. And then you have binge eating disorder. So they have these three main ones that they talk about in the chapter. And what they talk about is there's common symptoms of an eating disorder. And these are good. I'll let you kind of just pause me and read through these because they have their place. And you as a practitioner, you may notice like fluctuations in weight, or they come in, they're like, I don't feel well, I have stomach cramps, or, they have other things going on where perhaps they're having sleep problems, dental problems, different odds and ends. You can kind of look on the physical side that you'll actually be able to recognize. The emotional and behavioral, you probably won't recognize those, or they won't be as apparent as physical. So I would say just take a couple moments here and review this information, but I'm going to go ahead and jump forward from here. So the two different types that they talk about with eating disorders, you have anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. And with these, there's a quirky little difference between like anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and then when we get into anorexia nervosa, binge eating purging type, there's a little nuance there. But with anorexia nervosa, it's characterized by a restriction of energy intake relative to requirements, leading to significant low body weight. So that's kind of the key part when we start talking about whether it's anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa. It's the significant low body weight. There's an intense fear of gaining weight or becoming fat, persistence behavior that interferes with weight gain, disturbance in the way one's body weight or shape is experienced, meaning how a person perceives themselves, or when they look at the scale all the time, or how they look in the mirror, how they view themselves matters. So I talk about anorexia nervosa having these two predominant types. With anorexia nervosa, you have the restricting type, and then you have the binge eating and purging type. And this is where you kind of have to just really kind of dial in and pay attention. When you look at the two subtypes of anorexia nervosa, the restricting type itself and the binge eating type, the The restricting type is just that they're holding back food, they're not eating, they view food as the enemy, and it's not fuel for their body, it's something that makes them not look the way they want to look or makes them too heavy for a scale. The binge eating and purging type is when the individual eats and then purges thereafter. So they eat a bunch of food and they make themselves vomit thereafter. That's the binge eating and purging type. And those are under anorexia nervosa types because of the body weight itself. Usually it's classified as a significant low body weight. The difference you have is when we get to bulimia nervosa, which sounds very similar, right? You have binge eating, meaning the consumption of large amounts of food in a shorter period of time, followed by purging behaviors, which sounds just like binge eating and purging. But the difference is with bulimia nervosa, it's the actual body weight itself is not as low as you'd see with binge eating purging type. And that's where the real difference is. Now, what I'll point out is I don't think the book does a really good job of differentiating some of these things. And you might find you have to go out and do a little research on it. But those are kind of the key main takeaways when you look at those. And I will say this. When you look at bulimia nervosa, and they note this down at the bottom, it starts with weight loss, diet, and with weight loss dieting. And the food itself causes this kind of negative cycle. And you end up having like little triggers that cause people to go into this cycle. Like a great example is when I worked with that medical group downtown, there was one young lady and she had dessert the night before, and the next day she got on a treadmill and she ran so long, so hard, she ran herself to the point where she was dehydrated, she caused a heart arrhythmia, and she ended up in the ER. She ran herself into the ER at 27 years old because she had dessert the night before. So, my point to you is this. When you look at the conviction, the psychological, emotional drive it took to run for several hours on a treadmill to the point where she ran herself into the ER, that's a psychological, emotional component that drove the physical component. And my point to you is this. When they talk about in the first part of the chapter, or first part of this presentation, I talk about how it's classified as a psychological disorder. There's a lot to be said for that because there's a strong connection there. Now, with binge eating disorder, this is characterized by frequently eating excessive amounts of food. And the key you have here is they'll eat large amounts of food when not hungry, but also they'll get done eating large amounts of food and they feel disgusted with themselves, kind of depressed or very guilty. It's almost a punitive type of mindset that they'll go and force themselves to overeat. When they're done overeating, it becomes punitive, and they actually have a very negative voice, if you will, inside their head that's telling them how it was bad. And again, it gets back to that psychological, emotional side. So the book itself also gets into other specified feeding or eating disorders. It's kind of a catch-all for all these other maybe like on the border type of examples of anorexia nervosa. Maybe it's somebody who's anorexia who is not really considered underweight, but they still starve themselves. You know, they have these different kind of gray areas that they try to classify and lump into this area. You really want to spend much time with this, but I just want to point out this is where they would put these types of diagnoses. And they talk about like bulimia nervosa, low frequency, binge eating with low frequency, purging disorder, maybe randomly, atypical, which is what I just described, anorexia nervosa, where they don't meet all the criteria, or they maybe have significant weight loss and they don't meet any criteria for anorexia nervosa. So, so they kind of lump the different things into that one group. When I talk about dysmorphia can be for males and females. I mean, you can look at anybody in the gym, and I can guarantee you when you look at a gym environment, you're going to have females that think they can be more muscular, and you have males who think they can be more muscular. The book also goes in and describes the female triad, and the female triad is something that was usually associated with female athletes. When they have too low of body fat, they'll have low energy, they'll have what's called secondary amenorrhea, meaning they have a cessation of their menstrual cycle, and they'll also have low bone mineral density. But that's not to say it is exclusive to athletes. that could very well be somebody from the general population can have the same type of female triad or female athlete triad symptoms. It's just that they're not an athlete. When we look at the different things that go into this, it was first discovered in the athletic population, but it's actually become more prevalent, or at least not more prevalent, but better recognized across all populations is another better way to say it. So I'm going to go ahead and scoot myself off to the side here, and I'll talk through this. This is actually a pretty good little list. If you have somebody who comes in who's recovering from an eating disorder, you could probably draw from this list and not go wrong. And I can tell you, like in my group downtown, with that medical group, I was many times given a very specific set of exercises and program to follow to the letter, where exercise itself was no longer punitive. We didn't run ourselves into the ER for eating dessert the night before. We viewed exercise as a positive complement to a positive lifestyle. People actually ate food and they could come in and work out. There wasn't a negative connotation. So, I had to follow with a very strict within very strict guidelines, workouts that were given to me, literally prescribed for those individuals, and I administered those workouts. Reason is they were metered out in a way where they had a support system in place from a holistic standpoint, meaning psychologist, the personal trainer, that was me, the nutritionist, as well as other people on staff who worked with that individual to try to help bring them back to health and wellness. So I was part of a multidisciplinary team, and I had to fulfill my role, and that's that scope of practice I always talk about. It was very specific, and I had to operate within those bounds. So with that, guys, I have no doubt at some point in your career, you'll have somebody who will have either had history with some type of eating disorder, or they'll be going through the process. Where it is a benefit is to pause the screen on some of those slides and look at like where maybe you can find ways to intervene and help, and then also understand what is appropriate and what is your scope of practice, and really how far along can you help that person until you actually have to bring in a professional physician or somebody who is in the medical field who can help that person. All right, guys, I'm signing off. Have a good one. Bye.